we start with Nicole Buchanan, who is a professor of psychology from Michigan State University and the clinical director and founder of the Alliance of Psychological Associates. She's also an advisory committee member of the Chacruna Institute for Racial Equity and Access Committee, as well as a trainee for MAPS MDMA studies, if I understand correctly. And she very much hopes that the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training and anticipates offering the psychotherapy when clinical trials with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy are completed. So welcome, Nicole. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be able to talk today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. How is that? Good? Okay, great. So, as a clinical community psychologist, I have been very vocal about the ways in which psychological science is going to need to change or risk becoming irrelevant to the masses. And if we look at how the field has functioned so far, it's failed to train clinicians in a way that allows them to be prepared for this rapidly diversifying population. And we see that this happens not only in who's currently trained, but also in the psychology workforce and who's coming through the pipeline. So we have a problem here where we have a population that's becoming ever more diverse, but we have clinicians that are not matching that diversity. And then when we look at those individuals that are doing psychological science research, that pool of individuals is even less diverse than the general psychology workforce. And the psychedelic renaissance has not truly extended itself to people of color or to the Black community in particular, which is the community that I represent. Black people continue to use psychedelics at a lower rate than do whites. And like much of the mental health field, psychedelic assisted therapy has failed to center the needs of people of color. Over 80% of participants in treatment trials are white, and less than 3% of them are Black. And across the globe, only 2 investigators for MDMA assisted psychotherapy studies are women of color, at least as far as I know. Trainees in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy program still remain overwhelmingly white. And notably, it was only in August 2019 that MAPS welcomed its first cohort, and as far as I know, Asian and Indigenous trainees. As a result, this absence of people of color means that the protocols, procedures, and the training is often developed with little or no input from diverse scholars, and that participants of color do not have the benefit of having therapists and teams that are reflecting their cultural backgrounds. And as a consequence of the oversight, the consequences of these oversights are painfully articulated in the few writings by scholars of color about their experience in the field. And so what I want to talk today about is how do we go about increasing participation in psychedelic science? First, I want to acknowledge that the suggestions I'm offering today are not entirely novel and build off of the work of decades of scholars that have been discussing how to decolonize and diversify research generally, as well as Monica Williams and her colleagues' work on doing this specifically for psychedelic science. So one, we have to ask ourselves, who is doing the science? So as stated earlier, the scholars involved in the research are overwhelmingly white, including those that are offering therapy in clinical trials. And we cannot continue to have a science by and for white people if we want to be legitimate science that serves the world. The pictures I have on this particular screen, these are from the Williams et al. Article that I just showed you. And this is a picture of her research team. So representing a lot of diversity across visible and domains that are not visible from these pictures in order to make sure they're having input from a diverse group of people and that they are meeting the needs of diverse groups of people. And outside of simply diversifying the people, we need to deepen the knowledge of the concerns of people of color that they may be bringing to our research sessions. So during psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, clients are incredibly vulnerable. They're stripped of their defenses, they're physically unable to leave during the sessions, and this ends up raising the standards for clinicians' cultural awareness and their competence in discussing sensitive concerns related to race, as well as their intersections with other key identities such as gender and sexuality. So with this in mind, for the very first requirement for psychedelic assisted psychotherapists needs to be a vigilant practice of intersectional cultural humility. We need to acknowledge that race-related contextual factors are important components of set and setting. And Williams and colleagues highlight a number of the themes that they experienced when they went through MDMA sessions that were specific to their experiences as Black women. And if you haven't seen that article, it's a wonderful article talking about them going through the trial and experiencing themes that were particular to them as Black women that the therapists did not know or understand how to discuss, or even experiencing microaggressions during the session that then limited the depth that they could go because their trust was broken. So the therapist's lack of understanding and engagement in these racist behaviors during treatment sessions actually highlights the urgent need to increase the number of therapists of color to provide these treatment trials as well. Then we also have to think about what are we doing to actually attract these communities? What are we doing to let them know that it's happening? And what are we doing to actually invite them in if they do find out that we're doing this kind of work? And this is going to go beyond simply advertising about our studies. We need to be in the communities. We need to be talking and educating and creating relationships with the communities that we hope to bring in, because there's many valid reasons for them to be hesitant to come to us for these kinds of treatment trials. I also encourage people to review their advertising for their trials. Look at what are the themes that you're representing. Who are you highlighting in your advertising? So very often people will depend on the fact that people will want these treatments and come to them, but then that's how we only have 80% of participants, or we have over 80% of participants being white, because we're not thinking about who's missing. So as you can see on this advertisement, this is again from the Williams paper that I showed earlier, that not only is a person of color centered in their advertisement for their study, but they also include police imaging, because that is one of the common forms of trauma that people of color experience in the United States. So by highlighting not only the people, but relevant themes, it draws attention and increases curiosity, and it is a marker that the people involved in the study understand something about my experiences. It's also important that even at the stage of the advertisement that you address safety at the onset. Again, there are many, many concerns in communities of color about what will it mean to participate in these kinds of trials, as well as the high level of policing and criminalization of drug use that happens in our communities. So we need to make sure that at the onset, we are addressing safety, because otherwise we won't even get people to the door to talk to us further. And I also encourage organizations to look at the setting they've created. You know, do they have diverse staff that are welcoming people, that are answering the calls? What is the art like in their offices? What's the music like? What are the reading materials that they have? And I encourage, again, an act of cultural humility to openly request feedback on how they're doing, and how they're doing specifically to meeting their needs as a person of color, as a queer person, as a woman. Directly asking that is not only a marker for openness and willingness to have the conversation, but it is acknowledging that these individuals are experts on their experiences and that there's always more we can learn to do better. And then we need to look at the protocols that we're using. And there's a lot of things I'm throwing out there. They're bigger than a 10-minute talk, but if we go back to the basic premise that the research protocols that we are doing now have been developed for and by white people, then the fact that other people have been missing means that there's obviously going to be content and problems in our protocols that need to be reassessed. So one of the things Monica Williams notes is that the intake and informed consent process needs to be a little bit different. it needs to go deeper into some of the concerns and fears that might be present in the community. It needs to address the risk and harms and the rumors about these kinds of medications in communities. They need to take longer and make sure that they are really giving people an opportunity to be informed as they participate in consent. And in doing this, that also requires tell others about it in order to create that support, or do they have some concerns and they don't want to talk about it with certain people in their community? Walking people through that, walking them through how to talk about it, and if at all possible, bringing in their community to participate and support them is really incredibly important. Oh, okay, it's time. And this is sometimes an unusual one, but we have to center social justice in this work, I believe. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is at this point standing at a crossroads, and it has the potential to be a therapeutic method that is going to center social justice and embody a healing justice. But we can continue down the road we're currently on, and we will perhaps offer that, but only offer that for a small proportion of the community. And to me, that is not enacting what these healing medicines demand of us. It is not reaching our full potential. The healing justice demands that we make healing a political act of resistance against oppression, and we conceptualize healing as a facet of social justice. And in doing that, we have to make the work of healing accessible for all people. So with that said, psychedelic science cannot live up to its potential without addressing systematic injustice that is inherent in its current enactment. By having primarily white researchers working with primarily white clients, this is robbing communities of color from the radical healing that these psychedelics promise. And we know that these medicines originated among communities of color, and then those same communities were then criminalized and denied access to these substances. So we cannot allow the healing that accompanies our modern psychedelic renaissance to continue to overlook their trauma and their right to healing. So if we are going to do this right, we need to engage in community outreach and education, acknowledging the valid reasons why people might be afraid, acknowledging the history and narratives that taught them that psychedelics were going to make them go crazy or burn their brains, the history of criminalization and police surveillance of people of color. This also means actively being engaged in decriminalization advocacy. We cannot be passive and then claim that we're interested in diversifying our field. And we need to engage in financial collaboration with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. We have to make sure that, given that these originated from those communities, that we are actively and intentionally giving back to these communities.